In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of putting all of this ratio analysis stuff that I've talked about in some of these prior videos together and kind of some of the implications of it and kind of what that means and why you should be thinking about it in terms of the big picture here. So the first point to start with is that really when you start connecting the ratios together in your analysis, it leads to much more powerful insights. So sometimes people get a little bit too focused on looking at, say, just the current ratio and just the debt ratio, or just the net profit margin or something like that. But when you start looking at how they interact with each other and what the picture is that they're conveying, that's when your analysis starts becoming much more powerful. So let me give you some examples of kind of how some ratios would kind of fit together, kind of get you thinking along the right line. So, for example, large changes in inventory. If there are large changes in inventory, that can explain differences in trends between the current ratio and the quick ratio. So the quick ratio is not affected by inventory, but the current ratio is. And so as a result of that, if I had large changes in inventory, then that could cause a divergence in the trends for the current ratio and the quick ratio. But that divergence in trends between the current ratio and the quick ratio would also occur probably with movements in the inventory turnover ratio because we built up a bunch of inventory. So all of a sudden, if I'm looking at a current ratio and a quick ratio, I see that they're headed in very different directions, like something's going on with inventory. And then I look over there at inventory turnover, and sure enough, something is going on with inventory turnover, which basically is starting to paint a picture of something has happened with inventory management. And I should look into this a little bit more about, are we building up inventory? Are we getting rid of inventory on a proportionate basis? Why are we making this change? Is there something that triggered the change? What's causing this? Another example of something you can kind of think about would be large purchases of fixed assets may create noticeable changes in both fixed assets, asset turnover, and total asset turnover. So if I buy a whole bunch of fixed assets, I'm going to boost my fixed asset amount, which is probably going to cause my fixed asset turnover to drop. But by buying all these assets, that also increases my total asset amount, which may cause that to drop. And so if I'm analyzing those over time, I may see a blip downward in both. And it may be related to the same thing, or maybe it's linked to a significant acquisition. And so if you look at it, you're like, why did fixed assets jump so much? And why did total assets jump? And then you research it and you find out, they bought out a company this year and they had a lot of fixed assets and assets in general. And so this is why that dropped. And so now it kind of starts to explain, well, maybe this is why there are all these changes in ratios at this point, is basically because of the fact that they bought out a company during this point in time. So that's where you kind of have to start looking at, okay, if I'm looking at multiple ratios and I start seeing some commonalities here, maybe this helps my analysis be essentially more powerful. Okay. Now another way you could look at this would be, or another example, the composition of debt is going to influence the extent to which the debt is going to relate to times interest earned and also potential liquidity ratios. And I actually kind of alluded to this in a prior video. But if I had two firms that had a 70% debt ratio, but one of them, it was all long-term bonds, the other one, it's all like accounts payable. Well, the company with all the long-term bonds, that's going to very drastically affect their times interest earned ratio, almost certainly, because they're going to have all these interest payments they're making. But the company that has all of it in accounts payable, well, you don't pay interest on accounts payable. So they could have a huge amount of debt, but actually still have a really high times interest earned because they aren't paying interest at all. Now, what you'll also see is that the effect on the current ratios and quick ratios for both of these firms would be very different. The company with all the debt that was bonds payable, and it's all long-term bonds payable, nothing's coming due soon, they got all this debt, but it doesn't really affect their current ratio that much, if at all. The company that has virtually no long-term debt, but all accounts payable, well, accounts payable are all in current liabilities, which is directly going to tend to reduce the current ratio. So I would see very different kinds of ratios for those two scenarios. They could have the same debt ratio, but times interest earned is going to look different. Liquidity ratios are going to look very different, basically due to the composition of the debt. And so as another example here, if, and I talked about this in a prior video, if a company took on more debt, that would tend to increase the equity multiplier, which would tend to increase the return on equity, as long as the company has a positive return on assets. So if I see a return on equity going up relative to a competitor, you need to be a little bit careful and think before you think, oh, this is fantastic, we're doing so well, return on equity went up. Let's look a little deeper. Was that due to profitability going up? No. Net profit margin, was that due to total asset turnover going up? Was it due to the debt ratio going up? What led to it going up? And if the answer is the debt ratio went up, well, it doesn't mean that it's bad. Maybe the level of debt they have is appropriate. Maybe that was an appropriate choice for them to increase the level of debt. You'd have to analyze that. And if you conclude that it's appropriate, it's like, okay, fine, it went up. But that doesn't mean that this is the start of some new trend either, because it's not like I can just take on more and more and more and more and more debt in terms of the debt ratio year after year after year. Eventually, I'm just going to have too much debt, right? So you have to look at kind of the underlying pieces. And there's so many different ways that you could look at this. But really what I'm kind of driving at here is don't just look at one ratio all by itself. Try to look at the entire picture and how it all fits together. So for instance, here's another example. What if the company boosted their profit margin, looks like return equity went up, things look great, but also their day sales outstanding quadrupled. Oh, well, now that's interesting, right? So if my profit margin went up, that's coming from the income statement. And if it looks like return equity is looking great, probably affected by the income, right? But if my day sales outstanding quadruple, that means it's taking me drastically longer to collect on my sales. And it actually starts raising serious questions about whether I will ever collect on the sales. And if I don't collect on the sales, at some point in the future, I'm going to have to write these sales off as bad debt expense, which kind of means, well, I'm not entirely sure I've really made this money. I'm showing this as a net income on my income statement, but it's a little bit of a question about whether I'm actually ever going to really make that money because I haven't collected. And if I don't collect, I'm going to wind up having to write it off later. And so all of a sudden, that the thought of, hey, net income went up, profitability looked good. All of a sudden now I look at it with a little bit more suspicion here. Like, I don't know, maybe this isn't so good. I mean, it's kind of concerning that it's taking so much longer to collect now. And that's kind of another example, one of those things I'm looking at with, or trying to get you to think about with, don't just look at one ratio by itself, try to look at that whole picture of, everything kind of fits together. And if something looks like it's kind of going the wrong direction, well, let's think about what that means and how it relates to the other ratios, because it could really drastically affect my interpretation of the other ratios. I might have been about to think, hey, profitability looks great. And now I'm kind of questioning that. If the day sales outstanding went up a bunch, it's like, but is it really good profitability? I mean, I'm not actually getting paid for these sales yet. So maybe it's not so good. So again, and try to look at the whole picture here. And really what you're kind of trying to answer when you're doing a ratio analysis is, what do the ratios indicate for the health of the company as a whole, right? So what does it mean for the health of the company as a whole? So I might be a little bit, the company might be weaker in a few spots here, looks great in some other spots, but as a whole, what do we think? Okay. And so the example I like to use is that the ratios and actually various other types of financial analysis for a company are really like facets of a diamond. And so in other words, I've got a diamond and I'm looking at it from all these different angles and it's still the same diamond, right? So it's all the same diamond, but I'm looking at it from these different angles. And basically these different angles are kind of telling part of the same story. And so the goal is to see the whole story and to not focus on just one little piece. Because if you're not careful, you could just analyze like a current ratio and be like, they're great. And then you get to a bunch of other ratios and you're like, they're awful. And meanwhile, you may have kind of missed the fact that maybe there's some connections with those current ratios. Maybe, for instance, the reason their current ratio has increased is because they've been stockpiling inventory, which they aren't selling. And so now all of a sudden it's like, well, really that current ratio wasn't so good. It was kind of because they made bad inventory choices. So again, the point I'm kind of making here is look at the whole picture, look at it from all the different angles, make sure you're thinking about how all of those things relate to each other. And in order to try to figure out, is the company doing well or not? And that's really the goal of financial ratio analysis or financial statement analysis, to try to figure out that big picture. How are they doing? Are they doing well or not? So don't just look at one ratio by itself. Try to look at the whole picture and kind of piece it together. The best way to do that, if you are doing a ratio analysis, at least from my experience, go through and you start by analyzing each ratio by itself. But make sure you're trying to think about how the ratios relate to each other. And if you're working on that enough, eventually at some point the light bulb should go off and you realize, this change with this ratio relates to that change with that ratio. And maybe that doesn't mean what I thought it meant when I first wrote about that or first analyzed that. There's actually something going on here. And then you improve and you iterate and you kind of work through it and you get a better sense for what's really going on. So it's a bit of a process, but that's kind of the goal, to try to interpret those things, to kind of understand what the ratios are telling us, what the financial statement analysis is telling us as a whole. All right, hopefully this video has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.